I've mentioned before that I spent some serious amount of my life messing around with poetry, and I'd be loath to show you examples of it or to read them to you, but uh, I really couldn't make the operation work until I found sound, meaning things like rhythm, there's something about the way a crow shook down on me, the dust of smoke from a hemlock tree, has given my heart a change of mood and saved some part of a day I had rued, from Robert Frost. There's something about that rhythmically that engages you, right? And there's something in that sound I found that enabled me or provided me a vehicle for meaning. And there are books on the subject, by the way. And I've certainly read out of, if not all of the, feels like sometimes I've read all the books on how to write a poem. I appreciate fully you all who are trying to figure out how to paint. It sometimes is actually useful to have a parallel path for yourself. Try to accomplish something else, some musical instrument or language or something, while you're trying to figure out how to paint. There are several things like that have been going on in my life, and I found them beneficial to have. Anyway, that's another. It takes me off track just a little bit, but it circles around the question of design, and this is a question that's been hanging out there a very long time. And I was a little bit hard pressed to talk about it because it's so hard to address. Uh, there's so much that can be said about design, its importance, its means, its best ways to get there, that sort of thing. But in different kinds of paintings that have different necessities design-wise, right? So different purposes in a particular picture. So I don't, I could be there forever, but let's just read the question from Richard. I've read many things about design, competition, and composition, and rules one can apply. I love that. The rules one can apply. I get the sense. So that's thought one, right? The rules one can apply. I get the sense that distinctive design is largely a matter of understanding the core features, the line, the value, the color, as you point out, and developing an instinct for what will work best for the situation at hand. As with good drawing, I don't believe it's a matter of merely getting things correct, as by measuring, for example. One can compose according to rules and still end up with a boring picture, which is for sure. To make music, as you wisely point out, should not a sense of design come from some deeper place? So when I started talking about sound, and this whole thing is, I used to spend my time trying to write a very important poem, and I know you guys are in that box frequently when it'll stifle you in terms of painting as well. Well, you got to make a very important painting. In the meantime, you haven't even got the capacity to make a beautiful one. So what is that, though? Except that I found that the flow comes with the being in the right place, So as I said, at least for me, and I'd love to hear some other, some poet involved with this. At some point, I really would like to get a poet or somebody else with me in a conversation, a musician of the type I'm having here with this, because the parallels are so interesting and so instructive. But okay, I better start from the beginning of this. I've read many things about design, composition, and rules one can apply, right? That's what you're all looking for. What are the rules, right? So we can just do it and have a nice, happy day. He gets a sense that the distinctive design is largely a matter of understanding the core features. Well, that's distinct. So distinctive already puts you in the world of saying something about doing something special. I tell students all the time that there are many pictures are designed on the pyramid. So if you're going to do one, you better do a better one, so to speak, than anybody else has ever done. Well, what is that? How would you accomplish that? Well, it's not really better as much as it's always being interesting and being yourself. And yourself will be the difference, right? That's the difference maker, is the fact that it's you doing this pyramid and not somebody else. But if it's not any good, of course, that difference may not mean anything. So if you don't know, so to speak, the rules, at least the factors. Now, the basic rules are we need variety and interest, right? Variety and unity. So interesting and hanging together. And so all of a piece. I'm saying these several things, same thing, several different ways. All of a piece, but fun, entertaining, right? Which is all about variety, isn't it? So if you can maintain that, then you have some chance with the line value color. And I suggest to you, this isn't a primer on composition, but you have to be able to be, your picture has to be unified around line, has to be unified around values and around color. And I'm going to show you a couple of images of my own because I don't feel entitled to talk about other people's. I can talk about other people's good composition, but how they got there is, you know, that's something they know, and may undoubtedly, I should say, have a lot in common with what I do, or with anybody does. But he talks about and developing an instinct for what will work best for the situation at hand. Now, I don't know what one means by a situation at hand. If you mean at the situation at hand, by that you mean, I've been given to do a design that's round. I have to make a sphere and have to design the picture for that. That's a situation at hand. Well, or do you mean the situation at hand? It's a landscape sitting out there. I could do anything. I could do wide or square, long, do vertical, square, whatever, all sorts of different proportions. I can select this or that as my center of interest. I don't know what you mean by the situation at hand. But what I am going to suggest you do is begin to get your head around the idea of what center of interest does for you. And I'm going to pick that up in a second. As with good drawing, I don't believe it's a matter of merely getting things correct, as by measuring, for example. That's sort of the golden mean thing. Can we get to a good design by devices, right? But merely getting things correct by measuring, I'm sure he means something like site size or some other thing. And so it's correct. Now your drawing is correct, but it's dead, right? That's not an unusual thing to see. One can compose according to rules and still end up with a boring picture. So, but you won't actually if you buy into the idea that you think the rules are there about maintaining unity mostly, right? But they're not actually. The rules are there to actually get you to realize that sort of the two rules that really matter, like the great constitution of painting, is unity and variety. So you have two jobs. You can't be boring if you're actually being interesting. You have to watch your picture, though, and to see actually where the interest lies. And that, I think, is a point he wants to make. And then given that, and again, now we're taking us back to the center of interest, which I'll show you with the images. But given that center of interest, it begins to give you something that you can then begin to draw unities or draw connections with, correspondences with. It's much the same as if I said, look, we're going to have this red rose in the picture, and it's going to be a relatively, say light picture or something like that, and the red rose is going to be featured. Well, you're certainly going to be, say you have one big mass of some color around the rose. It's got to be the one that the rose has chosen for itself. In other words, the one that features the rose beautifully, right? So in other words, everything is listening to the rose, listening to the rose, listening to the rose. And that's very typical, right? And yet, beauty is driving this ship. So you can try to do it in various ways, but if you don't get the song, if you don't get these two colors to play to each other, nothing good is going to happen. And that's the same with the rest of design. I bet I'm losing people. I'm going to try to go past this and get to the point he really wants to make. To make music, you wisely, as you point out, should not. He's asking, should not a sense of design come from a deeper place? So the answer is that, of course, it should, right? But where does the deeper place come from, right? And that's where I found the mystery is that you have a deeper place, right? That's kind of like interesting. So I think of the mystery of design. But so if you want to look at the one on the left side, that's all it is a chair in the middle of a room with a couple hat box and a couple hats hanging around it. I call it old hat, by the way. My idea of a pun, which my gallery operator nicely decided to call the old hat, which takes all the fun out of the naming process. Nevertheless, in this setup here, I had a chair that I rather liked, and I decided to do something interesting. Decide to create a center of interest with it. Right. The chair already worked well in my general environment, which is it's a brownish studio. It's a lot of wood in my studio, and and there's also given the considerably is given kind of a given is there's some green tiles on the floor. So very quickly this thing worked out to be this is golden center, if you want to call it that, right? And there's this green element, and so in different places I found myself talking about greens. If I can, my eyes aren't there. We go. But you'll find greens, just very distant greens, right? So this is actually a very neutral picture. But if you look at this thing and you say, all right, well, let's make a center of interest. Let's just make an interesting center of interest and see where it takes us. Then you get the idea of what I'm talking about. So you make an interesting center of interest. Well, that's when you apply all these rules about interesting. It's about variety and lost and found and just entertaining aspects of dark, light, and edge. If you're understanding our game. And before you know it, this thing here, the center of interest here, has something like a gesture, right? It has a big sweeping thing. And you can begin to see how I then think to design around that thing there. Now, first of all, you might say it's coming from a deeper place, but that's where you don't just set up a nice center of interest. You set up one where you say yes. I mean, in other words, you're responding from deep inside. And then everybody else in the whole picture knows where you're headed, what the general idea is, and therefore what they must do in their supporting roles. So sometimes I think of this one of the things I find necessary as well when writing a poem is I have to have this sound thing going on, but I have to have a first line, a table setting line, right? I think of it again like that way as the overture. And I think of the center of interest as, and this is Gamble talking now about that, what it does to you from across the room. But I think of the center of interest here as that your eye goes right to there first. So it's setting the table for everything else that ever happens in the picture. Well, so does that first line in the poem. The way a crow shook down on me, the dust of snow from a hemlock tree. And it's just fairly typical, right? I mean, that first line stuff. And I'm just saying that's what one might do. But in that first line is this a massive content and heavily driven by your mood. And I'd say it's heavy with mood, I think would be a better way of saying it. C.S. Lewis said, somebody asked him about the Narnia series, how he stayed focused, and he said, I just keep picturing it, a fawn with an umbrella. And so if you follow that's not a fawn with an umbrella necessarily as much as it's a mood creator. It's the sense of the fantasy, the fantastic, a certain particular kind of fantastic, and something that tickled him inside or whatever, connected with him in some soulful way. So each time you do a center of interest, that's your job actually, is to get it up there and say yes to it, right? And then you can begin to design a picture by saying, well, what do we got? And then you can start talking about where in the rectangle all that stuff goes and all those things. Well, yeah, so every word of this rather is subjective, right? But and that's that deeper place, but it's a response. And the most difficult thing, and I want to say this, make it really clear if I can, the most difficult thing for a painter to do in teaching impressionism, for example, I find this with students, the most difficult thing for them to do is to put down a note and look at it. They keep wanting to mix the right note and then put it up there and hope it's good. But the idea of putting down a note and looking at it and responding to it and watching it to other things and get into the play with it, that's very true of a center of interest. Don't go up there and decide, I got to be special and I got to make myself a really good designer. Just go up there and just entertain yourself. Just do things. Now, a few things will happen. Do things meaning move things around and try this, try that, and a lot of trial and error. I lost one of those little lines there. But at some point, though, there'll be a point where you're saying, oh, well, that looks like twos, or that looks like this, or that's doing that. I won't tell you what I see as a weakness in this picture, but there are things in every picture that you have to be totally aware of in the world of the solecisms, things to avoid. And the solecisms, what is that? Where's another word for that? The sort of like the things you're being warned against. Sometimes if you talk about Degas, of course, he would say, why do we have to obey that one? And that's fair enough, but you might find you do. One of the common ones is the rule of twos or whatever, but it's really a rule of equality. And I say to a student, things don't have to be exactly unequal. They just can't appear to be equal, right? So it's just those kinds of things. You see what I'm saying? But stay visual. But in the meantime, though, the big deal is to get an idea and build on it, right? And I mean, get an idea. I don't mean out of your head. Put stuff up there. You're talking about impressionism. You're talking about painting from life. You talk about a still life. And the same thing applies to imaginative paintings, but you have to create the center of interest and let the rest come. I was entertained again by that comment by Gamble where he said, well, you get something in architectural background, something, you float a couple figures in there, and then you figure out what the story must be. I think that's most entertaining. Um, um, the importance of the subject, huh? Then working, but there are many ways to to similar ends. So but among other things, what you're doing when you're designing, like this over here, this is just a plate. It's a Greek vase. It's a plate design, and all they are is just cut out patterns basically. But how did he get interesting, right? So the interesting is like none of these openings here are even beginning to be the same. All these darks, what we call negative shapes, they're not even beginning to be the same, right? The feet are doing interestingly different things. So the arms are doing different things. Everything about this thing is about doing different things that actually then they get together though, don't they? They get together and this is a beautiful design. Those little circular plates are great ones to look at. And by the way, Zhang there suggested we look at them. But just look how interesting this can be. Just a sheer pattern, just as dark and light spots. I mean, just you can look at the play of any group here, and then the tailing off of this dark. You say this group here, and the tailing off, and or when you're watching this group, if you're a good designer, when you're watching this one and this one, you're watching that one at the same time, or you're seeing the entire set at the same time. So, but in the meantime, it's a question of your response to it, and that's where I like Richard's comment there. It doesn't come from a deeper place. You have to put stuff out that you will respond to. Just period, right? Just put, and I'm talking about the design, the grouping, the whatever. And eventually, what happens is you eventually will find yourself in the midst of a storyline. I wasn't trying to design a hat picture. I wasn't trying to look like the inside of a shop or anything like that. It just came about, right? Eventually, you put a couple things on, really get an interesting abstraction, and you will find a storyline. And that's what Gamble was actually saying about his. It's very true of this kind of work. Now I'm saying a lot of stuff that hasn't. I'm wandering a little bit from the basic idea. My daughter sat for me, and this one I call Chloe in the Sky with Diamonds. And somebody was critiquing it. I couldn't possibly have been sitting out there with my Hubble telescope and watching this, or had Chloe sitting in front of the Hubble. So this isn't you could argue this is an imaginative picture, or at least an imaginative background. Frankly, this is not a sequined thing. I put nebula and stuff on her black dress. In fact, the dress is a combination. The costume is a combination of stuff that she had. This thing going down to a thing, and then a sweater across it to make more interesting shapes. But eventually, when I was looking at this, though, first of all, I was impressed with the general abstractions of the darks. It's a light picture with dark patterning, you might argue, and I was just intrigued by them. And one of the things you have to get your head around is something that it's now again, this is going to be very personal to you, right? By the way, Gamble did say that composition is very personal. But that doesn't mean it's lawless, right? And you can't, if you don't obey the laws, they'll spit you out, right? You'll have a bad composition. If you don't have unity, that's just a fundamental point. If you don't have unity of your elements playing to each other, and if you don't entertain me, so just do that simple. But we're talking about now line, color, and spot, value units. If you think that way, you're thinking big enough. But nevertheless, so you're looking at this, and very entertaining thing. But what I find you have to do to get unity. Now that's just in the abstract, right? You can say, but you got to respond to it and say, do I respond? Do I love this? Is this quote me, right? So I'm looking at this one of Chloe, and I eventually got my head around the idea that this. First of all, I thought it was sort of an hourglass, right? Big thing, tapering down into very thin, and then back out wide again. And eventually, as I was working along and seeing myself putting other things in there, I was beginning to wonder why they would be where they would be. And I began to get my head around something like a double helix. And that sort of picture helped me to develop the complexity of this thing here. Now, I'm not sure if double helix, even had a useful image of that. Like I certainly wouldn't have said I had a scientific image of that in my head, but I had something of an image. And this idea evolves itself as you put work out there and start making something happen, doing something happen, watch. And then all of a sudden, there you are. It's beginning to be something that you're responding to, and you're saying, oh, what is that? What are you up to? Right? And then you try to build, and you try to stay tuned to that. And so frequently it requires that you give it a name. Is it a warm picture or a cool picture? And that's the color side of it. Is it a dark picture or a light picture? Is the value side of it, or middle tone picture? And then there'd be the distribution of the values within that. But that whole distribution then comes around this whole idea of a linear concept. So an hourglass would be in that linear. So some people say pyramid. That's one kind of linear, but there are many kinds of pyramids. Some of which are actually like three-dimensional pyramids. Other ones are just repeated diagonals that go right through the picture, sideways, whatever. Um, so so my evolution was all like that, though. I was just trying to create a great center of interest, and then it evolved into a um, uh, a more unifying idea. One the unity of which was uh, how would I say that better? An idea that was rich enough, had potential. You can tell if it has potential to actually engage more and more things. So you didn't really want a simplistic one. But nevertheless, you come up with an idea like that linearly. Make a thumbnail for yourself. I often do them in, just make a rectangle and then decide what the line is. Throw a line through a picture. This line idea comes from Jerome, the idea of a line and a counter line, right? The main line of a picture and its secondary line. So I guess that's it. I've talked probably a little too long. Did I want to say anything else? I think that was it. Thank you, Richard, for that question. And boy, if you can find the balance between the personal, which is everything about what the arts are. That's why a photograph will never be anything, right? It's never about anything. That's just something out there. But it's your personal response. That's why they say it's a painting is a picture of something through a prism of a personality, right? So yeah, and the mystery of that and how to access yourself, make sure you're doing both things at once is really quite the mystery in itself. You could argue that some of this is a left brain, right brain thing. So the right brain is sort of that soulful, amorphous, the jock guy that just goes around doing stuff. While the left brain is actually aware of all the rules and knows that it must do this and knows that it must do that. That dichotomy, it's a yin yang kind of a dichotomy. So yeah, play with these, enjoy, and get back to me with further stuff if you like, and share, comment, and all the rest. Okay. See you next time.